Stacy Feldman was a devoted mother whose life seemed picture perfect, but behind the walls of her home a dangerous secret was growing. Her husband, once seen as a grieving widower, soon emerged as a man with hidden motives, an affair, and everything to gain from her death. What began as a tragedy in the bathroom turned into a chilling story of betrayal, deception, and a crime carefully staged for silent Stacy Feldman lived a life that many believed was picture perfect. She was a dedicated mother of 2 children, known for volunteering at their school events and for being the reliable friend who was always there to lend a hand. To those who met her, she seemed to embody warmth and stability, someone whose home life reflected the same calm surface she projected outward. Her neighbors described her as cheerful, though private, and they admired how she managed to juggle family responsibilities with such grace. Yet beneath the smiling exterior, Stacy's life was more complicated than anyone could have guessed. The cracks in her marriage had been widening for some time, hidden from public view but present in the quiet corners of her home. Arguments, long silences, and suspicions of betrayal simmered in the background, leaving Stacy in a state of unease that only a few close friends knew about. The day of her death began like any other. Morning routines carried on with an air of normalcy, children leaving for school, neighbors exchanging greetings, the rhythm of daily life undisturbed. Nothing in the daylight hinted at the darkness that would soon unfold inside the Feldman household. By evening, news spread quickly that Stacy had been found dead in her own home. The details were vague, the explanations uncertain, but the shock of her sudden passing rippled across the community. Friends and neighbors who had seen her only hours before could not believe she was gone. The official word was that Stacy had collapsed. Her husband reported finding her unresponsive in the bathroom, claiming she had not been feeling well in the days leading up to the tragedy. To many, this explanation sounded reasonable. Illnesses often strike without warning, and accidents in the home are not uncommon. People who heard the story expressed sadness but quickly accepted the narrative. They assumed she must have suffered a medical emergency, a cruel twist of fate that ended her life too soon. But behind the simple account, investigators began to notice troubling details that would not let the matter rest so easily. When paramedics arrived, the scene struck some as unusual. Stacy's body was lying on the floor in a position that seemed strangely deliberate, as if placed rather than collapsed. There were no signs of blood or immediate trauma, yet the overall stillness of the room carried a weight that unsettled even seasoned responders. The husband's account was straightforward. She had fainted and fallen, nothing more, but the picture did not fully match his words. It was as though the pieces of the story had been carefully arranged, leaving behind a faint sense of something being out of place. The medical examiner's first assessment did not confirm anything sinister, and the possibility of natural causes remained on the table. Yet even in those early hours, a quiet seed of doubt had been planted. The bruises were faint but noticeable, and their placement did not align with the idea of a simple fall. Friends who came by to offer condolences felt an unease they could not explain, though none could have guessed how deeply the truth had been hidden. What looked like a sudden, tragic accident would soon unravel into something far darker. The days following Stacy Feldman's death were filled with sorrow, confusion, and unanswered questions. Friends brought flowers, neighbors prepared meals, and the community gathered around her family to offer support. On the surface, it seemed like a tragic accident that had claimed the life of a young mother, leaving behind grieving children and a devastated husband. But even as condolences poured in, a quiet unease settled among those closest to the case. The story of a sudden collapse seemed too simple, too neat, and some of the professionals who had first seen Stacy's body felt that there was more to be uncovered. The official explanation was that Stacy may have fainted, possibly due to exhaustion or illness. Her husband repeated this version to anyone who asked, his voice heavy with grief. He told authorities she had been unwell, that her energy had been fading, and that her sudden collapse was unexpected but not entirely surprising. For many, this sounded believable. After all, people often fall ill without warning, and death sometimes strikes without explanation. It was easier to accept this account than to imagine anything more sinister lurking behind the tragedy. Yet the medical examiner noticed troubling details that did not fit with the idea of a natural death. Stacy had faint bruises on her body, marks that were difficult to explain. They were subtle, but their placement suggested something beyond a simple fall. There were also faint signs on her neck, not immediately obvious, but enough to raise concern for anyone who studied them closely. These were not the kind of injuries one expected from a sudden collapse alone. Still, without stronger evidence, it was difficult to challenge the official story. Investigators began piecing together the timeline of the day. They questioned the husband, asking when he last saw Stacy alive, what she had eaten, and what symptoms she had shown before her death. His answers were calm and consistent at first, but small inconsistencies appeared when he repeated the story later. He seemed to add details that were not mentioned earlier, shifting the focus ever so slightly. While this could have been the result of grief or shock, detectives made careful notes. In cases like this, the truth often revealed itself in the details. Meanwhile, whispers began to spread in the community. Friends recalled conversations with Stacy where she mentioned feeling uneasy in her marriage. Some remembered her hinting at problems that she never fully explained, suggesting there were struggles she kept hidden. Others noticed that her husband seemed more distracted than devastated in the days after her death, focusing on practical matters instead of grieving openly. None of these observations could be considered evidence, but together, they added to the growing sense that something was not right if the case had ended there. Stacy's death might have been quietly recorded as a personal tragedy, closed with no further investigation. But the faint marks, the small inconsistencies, and the quiet suspicions refused to fade. For some investigators, the thought lingered that the story had been staged, that the surface of the tragedy concealed something deeper. As they looked closer, they realized that what had been presented as a sudden collapse might, in fact, be the carefully arranged cover for a crime. The deeper investigators dug into Stacy Feldman's life, the more they realized her sudden death could not be explained by illness alone. What began as a quiet suspicion grew into a determined search for answers. Friends who had once admired her seemingly perfect family now began to share details they had previously kept to themselves. Stacy, they revealed, had confided about her marriage more than once. She described her husband as distant, controlling, and secretive, though she rarely went into specifics. To outsiders, their home looked stable, but those closest to her sensed that cracks were widening beneath the polished surface. Financial records provided the first concrete signs of trouble. Detectives discovered that just weeks before Stacy's death, a substantial life insurance policy had been updated, naming her husband as the sole beneficiary. The timing seemed suspicious, as though preparations had been made in advance for a tragedy yet to happen. Bank statements showed unusual withdrawals and hidden expenses that suggested her husband had been living a double life. Combined with growing concerns about his behavior, these discoveries began to paint a troubling picture of motive and opportunity. The search of his phone records revealed another layer of deception. Late-night calls and messages to an unknown number stood out. The consistency of these interactions suggested more than casual communication. When investigators traced the number, it belonged to a woman Stacy's husband had been secretly seeing. The revelation of an affair provided the missing link, a personal motive that added weight to the suspicion already circling the case. The man who claimed to be a grieving widower now appeared to have both financial and emotional reasons to want Stacy out of the way, while detectives examined these external pieces. Forensic experts returned to Stacy's body with renewed focus. The bruising that had seemed minor now took on greater importance. Careful analysis revealed patterns consistent with restraint, the kind of marks that occur when someone is held down against their will. The faint discoloration on her neck, initially dismissed as unremarkable, was re-examined and identified as pressure marks. Though not obvious at first glance, they told the silent story of force being applied, suggesting that Stacy had not collapsed naturally at all. As evidence accumulated, the image of Stacy's final moments became clearer. It was no longer a story of sudden illness but one of struggle. The carefully staged scene in the bathroom began to unravel. Her husband's version of events had been too neat, too carefully arranged to withstand close inspection. What investigators now saw was the outline of a plan, one that relied on silence, secrecy, and the assumption that no one would look too closely. The combination of financial motive, a hidden affair, and forensic evidence turned what once appeared to be a personal tragedy into the clear possibility of homicide. For detectives, the path forward was no longer about whether a crime had occurred but about proving how it had been carried out. The truth was beginning to emerge, but there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. And each discovery only raised the stakes higher. The days after the revelations about Stacy Feldman's husband shifted the investigation from suspicion to focused pursuit. Detectives were no longer looking at a grieving spouse but at a man whose every action seemed carefully calculated. The inconsistencies in his story, the financial benefits of her death, and the discovery of his affair combined to create a chilling portrait of motive. What troubled investigators most was his behavior in the aftermath of Stacy's passing. Instead of being overwhelmed with grief, he seemed oddly detached, as if his loss was something to be managed rather than mourned. He handled paperwork swiftly, avoided emotional conversations, and appeared more concerned with controlling the narrative than expressing sorrow. His unusual composure caught the attention of everyone around him. Friends recalled how, at gatherings after Stacy's death, he spoke more about logistics and insurance claims than about his wife's memory. Some found his composure unnerving, while others dismissed it as a coping mechanism. But investigators recognized the signs of someone who was preparing for scrutiny and trying to stay ahead of it. Each small observation added to the growing sense that his story was not one of tragedy but of orchestration. The turning point came when the mysterious phone number linked to the affair was traced further. The woman involved confirmed their relationship, providing evidence that Stacy's husband had been living a secret life for months. The affair was not a fleeting mistake. It was long-term, emotional, and filled with plans for the future. With Stacy gone, he would inherit money, free himself from a crumbling marriage, and continue a new relationship unburdened by the past. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and together they formed a picture that was difficult to ignore. Forensic reports provided the final blows to the defense of innocence. Specialists recreated scenarios to compare with Stacy's injuries, and again, the results pointed to restraint. The bathroom scene that had been presented as the place of her sudden collapse was revealed as a deliberate staging. The position of her body, the absence of certain injuries expected in a fall, and the presence of subtle but telling pressure marks on her neck left little room for doubt. The conclusion was clear. Stacy had not died by accident. She had been silenced deliberately. Investigators built their case slowly, aware that one misstep could jeopardize everything. They documented every detail, from the timing of the insurance updates to the contradictions in her husband's retelling of events. Witnesses were interviewed, digital trails were followed, and each fact was carefully preserved. By the time the case was ready to move forward, the evidence had formed a web too intricate to dismiss. What had once been seen as the tragic collapse of a young mother was now understood as a calculated act of violence. The man who had portrayed himself as a devastated husband had been hiding behind a facade of grief while carefully arranging a crime scene meant to deceive. The silence surrounding Stacy's death was finally breaking, and the truth was emerging with undeniable force. The next step was taking it all into the courtroom, where the final battle for justice would unfold. The trial of Stacy Feldman's husband became the moment when every hidden truth was forced into the open. What had begun as whispers of suspicion and faint bruises on a body was now laid out in sharp detail before a jury. The prosecution wasted no time in building their case. They spoke of the carefully staged scene, the life insurance policy updated only weeks before her death, and the affair that revealed a man already preparing for a future without his wife. Each piece of evidence was presented methodically, creating a narrative that was impossible to ignore. The photographs of Stacy's bruises, the forensic reports describing restraint, and the phone records linking her husband to another woman painted a picture of betrayal and calculation. The defense tried to counter with explanations of coincidence and grief. They argued that the bruises could have come from a fall, that inconsistencies in his story were the result of shock, and that his relationship with another woman was unrelated to Stacy's death. They reminded the jury that grief affects people in different ways, and that outward appearances cannot always be taken as signs of guilt. But as the trial unfolded, the weight of the evidence pressed heavily against these defenses. Each time the husband's story was retold, small contradictions became larger, more noticeable. His calm demeanor, once thought to be composure, was now perceived as detachment. Witnesses added further layers of doubt to his version of events. Friends testified that Stacy had shared fears about her marriage, confiding that she felt controlled and uneasy. Experts explain how the marks on her neck aligned with deliberate pressure, not a fainting spell. Financial specialists described the unusual timing of the insurance updates and the significance of the policy amounts. Piece by piece, the prosecution built a wall that the defense could not climb. Inside the courtroom, emotions ran high. Stacy's friends and family listened to the grim details, their grief resurfacing with every photograph and report. The idea that her life had been ended not by fate but by the very person who should have protected her added another layer of pain. The community that once saw a family struck by tragedy now saw a household broken by deceit. The truth stripped away the image of a loving husband, replacing it with the portrait of a man willing to sacrifice his wife's life for money and freedom. When the jury finally deliberated, their decision did not take long. The evidence had spoken too clearly, and the staged scene had failed to mask the truth. The verdict was guilty. The quiet mask of innocence shattered, and with it, the silence that had surrounded Stacy's death was broken. Justice, though delayed, had finally caught up. For those who loved Stacy, the verdict brought some measure of closure, but it could never erase the loss. Her story became more than a case. It was a reminder of how appearances can mislead, how silence can be manufactured, and how justice depends on noticing the smallest of details. What had been staged to look like tragedy was revealed as murder, and the voice that had been silenced was finally heard in the courtroom.